Welcome to All Things with Jen Oshman, where we look at events and trends through a Christian lens. All things were created through Jesus and for Jesus, so we're seeking to apply His Word to what's happening here and now. Thank you so much for joining me on episode 70. I am sitting here with my good friend and sister and fellow Redemption Parker member, Andy Davidson. And I wanted to bring Andy on the show today because she and her husband served for a time in Afghanistan. And they have lots of lasting relationships and memories, obviously, and communication with the culture and country of Afghanistan. And I thought it would be really helpful to just take some time this morning to ask some questions of Andy, hear about her heart for the Afghan people, God's heart for the Afghan people, what life was like back then, what life is like right now, what she's hearing from inside the country, just so that she might help open your eyes and mine to the reality of life there. So Andy, thank you for coming on. I am so appreciative that you would take some time this morning to chat with my listeners. My prayer is that God will use this conversation for just for all of us to have our eyes open to what He's doing around the world. So thanks for taking this moment to just share with us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So let's just start our conversation off first by hearing from you about what took you to Afghanistan. What was it like for you and your husband? Paint a picture for us of what was going on globally, what was going on for you in your lives, in your marriage, in your church. Like what was that process? What took you there?
Right. Well, looking back, from the very beginning, it kind of started growing up in a Christian family where my dad had a real heart for missions, and he ran a missionary organization out of our church. And so that was a big part of my teen years, of just watching the value of bringing the gospel overseas. And my husband and I, one of the first things we did was go on a trip with this organization together in high school. So missions and bringing the gospel overseas was kind of an adventure that knit our hearts together and a big part of our early dating years and engaged years. So we got married. We spent some time overseas after we got married, and then had settled back down in Durango is where we were living. And Scott was a children's pastor at a church down in Durango. And this church was also really outreach oriented. So we would have these missions conferences every year, and we had no expectation to go overseas again. We kind of had felt like, we spent a year overseas before we had children, and that was our time. And we came back to a small town. He's a pastor in this church. We had 2 children, a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. And like I said, had no expectation, but we were just going to the missions conference. I think it was a June or a July. This was actually in 2002. So we head to this missions conference, and a speaker had shared an opportunity. They had explained what was going on in the church in Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban. And he explained that there was an interim government that was opening up the doors for non-government organizations to be set up. And he said, we think we only have a 6-month window to get these NGOs set up, but we need a team of people who are willing to go and help us set up an educational non-government organization that will be a means by which to bring the gospel. And I don't know obviously it was just the Holy Spirit, because my husband, we walked out of that session and Scott was just like, where do you want to go for lunch? And it was one of those moments in my life that I couldn't even think. I couldn't talk because I just sensed the Holy Spirit's calling to say, you should do this. You should set up this NGO. You should go talk to that speaker. And I had said to my husband, I know this sounds crazy, but I feel like we should go ask some questions. And he looked at me like, are you insane? And long story short, God just opened up our hearts to it. We went back to our church. We shared with our pastor, who was our mentor. And right away, he's like, you know what? We'll keep you on staff. We'll still pay your salary. We'll send you guys to Afghanistan. Wow. And it was surreal at the time, but it was one of those times that you just know God's in it, and so it feels so peaceful. Even though the circumstances bringing 2 toddlers to Afghanistan in 2002 seems like a crazy, insane thing to do, but within 2 or 3 months, we had all our support raised, and we had plane tickets for September of 2002 to move to Kabul with this organization. Wow. So it happened pretty fast.
So everybody that's listening knows September of 2002 is 1 year after September of 2001.
Yes.
What were your parents saying? What were your friends saying? I can imagine you had some pushback.
Yes. Well, my parents were super excited. They're very, they're big risk takers and so they thought it was wonderful. Scott's mom wasn't so excited. Yeah. She was pretty upset that we would bring her grandchildren to a war-torn country. There was even some people in our church that were questioning whether this was whether we were really hearing God's voice, whether this was really God who wanted us to do this. And, I'll never forget our pastor's wife actually got in front of the church and she said, I've heard some rumblings. I know that some of you are really doubting whether this is God's will for Scott and Andy and the children. But she gave this really powerful exhortation. She reminded them that her exact words were, the safest place for you and your children is in the center of God's will. Mm. And she said, we as their leaders believe this is God's will. We are sending them with our blessing. We're financially supporting them. They will be safer in Kabul with their children than they would have been staying here and disobeying God. Yeah. And that just spoke to my heart. It was it just bolstered my faith. Even in times when we were there and I felt a little unsafe, those words would come through my mind. Safest place for me and my children is in the center of God's will. And that really bolstered our faith. So our plane ticket was scheduled to land on September 11th, 2002. And our team leaders, when he found that out, he asked us to reschedule. So we canceled that ticket. I think we landed, maybe September